Walter, it's Robert Baird. Robert Baird was born in 1855. He was the son of William Savage Baird and the nephew of George Courtenay Baird. They had taken over the liquidated Ulster printing works in 1861, so they were originally printers. During the 9 years from 1861 to 1870, they formed the idea that they would like to produce their own daily paper that would provide instant, informative and accurate news. And the first issue was to be in September 1870. The brothers were originally from Randalstown, and in September 1870 we find amongst advertisements for gratins and various other pieces, we find them telling us of what the scope of their paper will be. It was a 24-column paper, and it had 4 pages. The paper went on from strength to strength down the years from 1870 to 1886. And in 1886, the year of the riots in Belfast, the young Robert took over. He had joined the company at 14 from Inst, but shortly after the company moved to Royal Avenue, the father died. Indeed, only 23 days after the firm moved. The original premises had become very, very cramped, and it was decided to build much more grander premises. H&J Martin were the builders, and it cost £7,800 to build. Malcolm Brodie says in his book, "Cometh the hour, cometh the man," and indeed I think this is a very appropriate quote. He had printer's ink in his veins. He was a dynamic man. One observer said he was the roundest of pegs in the roundest of round holes. He was a very philanthropic man. As a justice of the peace, he had paid the fine of one whom he had given judgment on. He played a significant role in community life. He was a man, Walter, of great presence. When he came into the room, heads would automatically turn to him. He attracted people to him. Like all the other great Victorian magnates of his time, he was very hard-working, often spending 18 hours per day at his desk. He ensured the paper's technological resources measured up to the best in Europe. There were many innovations that this involved. For instance, he installed a new plate-making process. He installed a pneumatic tube system which linked the paper to the post office in Royal Avenue. He was very much instrumental in having a London office for his paper. He bought this from the Manchester Guardian at 54A Fleet Street. He was willing to spend money to ensure that his paper would not only be the best in Ireland, but one of the best in the British Isles, and indeed one of the best in Europe.
Victorian Belfast must have been a very exciting place to work in. Business was going well, there was the linen industry, tobacco, shipbuilding, everything, rope making, and he was very much a Victorian businessman, wasn't he?
Very, very much so, Walter. Indeed, he was a benevolent dictator. Perry, as we talked about earlier, was also a dictator, but Baird was certainly much more benevolent in the sense that he was very, very careful to look after his staff very, very well. For instance, he had great consideration for them. He provided a yearly excursion, either to the Glens of Antrim, to Stranraer, or to Moy, or some other place that took the staff away from the grimness and the dreariness of industrial life in the city. He created the Ulster Saturday Night in 1894 for sport. This was called the Pink. This was an innovation because it was printed on pink paper. Then in 1896 he wanted to broaden his horizons even further, so he created Ireland Saturday Night. The company became limited in 1897, and he drew a salary in that year of £750. He also opened a Dublin office because he was keen to promote the then new sport of GAA. As I say, he was always trying to be one ahead of his competitors, and he achieved an awful lot in this respect. For instance, he put in a lot of high quality equipment. Ultra-modern production techniques were very important. Electricity was introduced, high-quality newsprint. And by 1900, we find that his journal is one of the most major in the British Isles. Circulation soared. He was a great man for the instant edition. Often you would find that crowds massed and gathered outside his premises in Royal Avenue to wait for the day's news, because like today we would think of television as the instant medium. Well, in those days people would go down and say, we'll wait outside the telegraph and we will find just what happened from the telegraph, and this was related word of mouth. He also had a very, very extensive distribution system. And this was based on very often young boys who were very often street urchins. They would go down, gather their papers, and go to what was called a pitch. Or they may go round a particular district where they maybe got a penny after selling a certain number of copies. And again, horse-drawn vans would extend the paper circulation out to various towns in the province.
He was full of good ideas then, wasn't he?
Very, very much so, Walter. I mean, I have read where in 1910 he thought, with the great cooperation of his then editor, Andrew Stewart, again a man very much ahead of his time, of installing a telephone link at Solitude to report on the Ireland-England soccer international match. That's the sort of man that he was. He always wanted to be ahead of his time. And right down to this day, the Telegraph has always enjoyed that kind of superiority over its rivals.
He was very keenly interested, wasn't he, in the society he lived in. Did he do a lot for Belfast? Well,
he was very interested in community life, but he was very anxious, Walter. He was an ultra-unionist man. He always felt that ever since 1886, when he was 31 and he took over the business, that Ulster was under threat. And so in 1886, we find him very much involved with the anti-Home Rule campaign, very much involved in 1893 with the Home Rule campaign then too. The whole idea was he was an empire man, and the Telegraph, or as it was called in those days, the Belfast Evening Telegraph, it always had a very strong link with the Ulster Unionist establishment. We find, for instance, during the First World War, it produced a very patriotic stance. Some would have said at the time that it was a propagandist stance. But then again, all newspapers were doing that during the wars, you know.
And the interesting thing is that, to some extent, in the newspaper world here, traditionally, papers have appealed to one side of the community or other. The Telegraph's always had a very cross-community feel to it, hasn't it?
It was indeed, because he was always most anxious that he never was a bigoted or sectarian man. He genuinely believed that the empire was good for Ireland as a whole, and that's what he was motivated by the strongest of motives there, and so we don't get the narrow, bigoted image attributed to some other people in the north of Ireland at that time. And then, of course, during the First World War, we find, for instance, that he was hampered very, very badly by the shortage of newsprint. What happened was that the German U-boats, they were sinking the ships in the Atlantic, and newsprint wasn't reaching. From 900 tons of newsprint, it dropped to about 300 tons, that he needed that for a regular output. And so he decided he had to be so intrepid and go around he really had to go around and find, by hook or by crook, newsprint that he could keep producing his paper. Again, he was very, very fortunate in that he had the inside track to most of the leading political figures of his day through a man who was his editor called Thomas Moles. Thomas Moles had joined the paper in 1902. How indeed he got through all the work that he was supposed to do, one doesn't know, because at the time he became editor of the Telegraph in 1925, he was a Westminster MP, he was a Northern Ireland MP, he had great interest in a very, very strong administrative function in running 5 sports in the north of Ireland at that time. He was on the council of the Northern Ireland Football Association. And so, but with Moles, Baird was able to keep track very much of what was happening because Moles was linked to the Ulster Unionist establishment. And, for instance, we see that when Robert was being married for a second time in London in 1920, incidentally, he married his wife's sister, we find no less a personage than Sir James Craig was at the wedding, and indeed also another personage of great distinction, Sir Edward Carson. So you see that he was right in the centre of Unionist feeling at that particular time.
He himself was knighted, wasn't he?
He was, indeed, in 1921 he was knighted, along with several other local dignitaries. Perry got a viscountcy at the same time. This was when the King arrived to open the Northern Ireland Parliament in 1921. He took great pride in that knighthood. He always was very keen that this was a personification. It wasn't for him, it was for the people of Northern Ireland, the new fledgling state of Northern Ireland.
The look of a newspaper says a lot about the times in which it lives, and the Telegraph has changed a lot over the times. You referred to the advertisements in the first edition, so the front page would look very different in that.
Oh, very, very much so. Very, very much so, Walter. And then, of course, we have the price of the paper. It started off at a halfpenny in 1870, and it stayed a halfpenny until 1917, and when it became a penny to buy it. And then in 1918, it changed its name to the Belfast Telegraph. The evening bit was dropped out. Towards the end of his life, then, he became the grand old man of Ulster journalism. And indeed, when he died, there was great sadness in the community. We're told that thousands and thousands of people followed his cortege up to the Belfast City Cemetery. And there was a special group of young paper boys, the street urchins. They followed as well. Craig Avon was there, and his entire cabinet was there as well. It's interesting today, Walter, when you look at his grave in the city cemetery, how indeed there it is. He's a man now largely forgotten, but his achievements linger on very, very much. There's a lovely story told of his intrepidness in trying to get a scoop. And this story is told in Bonfires on the Hillside by the former political correspondent and doyen of the Ulster Press, James Kelly. Kelly recounts that in the very early years of this century, there was a reporter called James Robinson who worked for the Telegraph. One day, Baird heard that a party of bee specials had been attacked in the town of Clones. Now, how they had got to Clones, which was then over the border, was this. They got it in this way. The transport officer of the RUC, a Major McCallum, he should have sent the specials because they were going to Enniskillen, and he should have sent them through Omagh. But he sent them through Clones. The local Republican guards waylaid the train, a lot of shots were fired, and indeed, just previous to that, a number of prominent unionists had been taken hostage. Now again, with his contacts, Baird heard this story was breaking, so he sent the young James Robinson, whose byline was Peter Robinson. He sent him down to cover the story. Peter Robinson travelled in Baird's own car, and when he got down across the border, he was arrested by the guards and taken as an Ulster spy. Now, Robinson was in fear of his life, and he was a bit afraid just to disclose his full identity, so he told the guards that, quite rightly, that he had worked for the Irish Independent in Dublin previously. Well, he gave his name as James Robinson. They went away, the Republican guards, to check out this story, and they phoned the Independent in Dublin. And the people in the Independent didn't know a James Robinson, or they thought they didn't know a James. They knew a Peter Robinson. Just in the nick of time, someone in the Independent office said, "Oh no, that Peter Robinson is Jimmy Robinson." So the Republican guards were told that, in fact, yes, the man is James Robinson and he worked for us. And General Owen O'Duffy said to the Independent, he said, "It's just as well," he said, "that you cleared that man, because we were just getting ready to put him up against the wall to shoot him." So it shows you that even in the midst of a story, the quest for a story, how one's life could possibly be put in some jeopardy.
Obviously, though, Robert Baird would have had a very keen eye on good journalists. He'd have picked the best men.
Very, very much so. And indeed, when Moles was the editor and people wondered how on earth he carries out all these functions, as well as editing the paper, and indeed there was criticism that he was carrying far too much parliamentary content in his paper. We have to remember that there was a John and Robert Sayers at that time starting their careers in the Telegraph, and they largely guided and steered the ship of the Telegraph through the waters, through those they are.
How would you think that Sir Robert Baird is best remembered then?
I think he's best remembered, Walter, as a great technological innovator, a man who's ahead of his time. Again, he's an example of this thing that happens in Belfast at the time. We had that period of time, we had people like Harland and Perry, and we had the rope-burst connection, we had the linen thread industry, incidentally, many of whom are buried in the city cemetery, and they seem to be world leaders. This great golden age of Northern Irish ingenuity was very, very out, and I think he personifies that very, very much. As I say, his obituary, which is well worth reading again, is full of Victorian and Edwardian grandiloquence. I think he was a great man.